click that record button. So, all right. So really quick, jumping in again, the title of this webinar is Cultivating Wellness for Queer Aging Men, in a conversation with Dr. Coden. Couple of housekeeping things that I want to jump into before we get too far into our conversation today is one, remembering to keep yourself off mute. You can keep your video on during the webinar. You can keep your video off during the webinar. I'm not married to it. I love to see y'all. I want to see y'all beautiful faces. I want to be able to engage with the facial expressions and all that jazz. I don't know, as a presenter and a conversationalist, it gives me a lot of energy to have that kind of connection with folks. So it'll be appreciated, but it's not required. Questions are welcome throughout. You can just drop it in the chat. And I have Dr. Pamphil logged on and she'll support us in organizing some of the questions. But in regards to Dr. Coden answering the questions, we'll leave that till the end of the segment, right? We have a few minutes towards the back end of our presentation today where he'll be able to engage with you all and answer questions. Lastly, just want to remind you all that this is a CEU opportunity for you. You have the opportunity to earn at least one CEU during the presentation, and that typically comes towards the end of the presentation. And so Dr. Johnson, who's running a little bit late when he gets on, he'll be able to share the link towards the end, but if for whatever reason he's not able to make it, we will use a registration list and provide you all with a link via email so you can get your credit, right? Because I know CEUs are really important. Other than that, I want to roll right into introducing our presenter and speaker today. So I'll read a really brief bio and then we'll jump into the fun stuff, which is the questions and the conversations that we're going to have today. Dr. Coden is a clinical psychologist. He is a graduate of the University of Chicago and a fellow of the American Psychological Association. He is a founder and a board member of the National Gay and Lesbian Health Education Foundation, a member of the New York State Martin Luther King Jr. Institute for Nonviolence, and a founding member and community activist of services and advocacy of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender elders, an acronym for SAGE, and the New York City AIDS Network. He is the North American representative for International Lesbian and Gay Association. Besides having authored many articles on gay psychology, he has published a book titled Gay Men, The Power of Gay Midlife in 2000, in the year 2000. And then he also republished that same book in 2022. He continues his activism with SAGE, and he and with his husband founded an ongoing salon focused on racism and white privilege. I personally am really excited for this conversation because I remember maybe 8 years ago, I was in a friend's home in New York City, and I actually saw your book, Dr. Coden. And I don't think I've shared this with you, but I came across your book that was published in 2020, and I read a few pages that day, and it hadn't dawned on me until we were in conversation this go around, and I saw the new book, and I went in Google, and I was like, oh, this book looks so familiar. And so it feels very divine and full circle to be having this conversation with you today, because 8 to 10 years ago, I stumbled across your work and thought it was so instrumental and necessary for not only to have those conversations then, but to really focus on the queer aging community in a real way. So without further ado, I would love to jump in and connect with you and for us to have some more conversations around the work you've done with clients, the work you've done with research, the work you've done with creating space and activism. All right. So Dr. Coden, and so we talked earlier. He says it's fine. I'm going to refer to him as Harold. So Harold, just to jump into our first question, I'd love to hear from you. Can you share a little bit about your journey and what motivated you to pursue the work you're doing now, or you've been doing throughout your career, really?
Okay. What I usually refer to is the beginning insight. I was arrested when I was 14 years old for being gay. And it was a situation of police entrapment. Um, but that didn't change the fact that I was arrested. And so the police were the people who told my family that I was gay. And because it was entrapment, and the judge, when we finally went to court, realized it, I got treated a little bit differently. But I still had to go to the detention home. And when I was in the detention home, I looked around and I saw filled with teenagers, my age, older, a little bit younger, but I didn't see anyone who looked like me, a white, middle class Jewish kid. They were all either Hispanic, because this was Los Angeles, so they were Mexican Americans, or blacks, or what in my thinking, they looked like kind of, I thought, hillbilly. But the point was, it went from knowing that I was illegal according to the law. I looked around and said, we're all alike. We're all outsiders. And I didn't have the mental capacity to talk about it the way I'm talking about it now. But I just knew that somehow I was more like them than I was like any other group. And then when I left home, um, the second I was no longer a ward of the court, which meant at 18, I left home and moved to Chicago because I had to live my life as a gay person. And when I was working for a number of years, and when I went back to school, or I started school, I should say, one of the big turning points was reading a book that was one of those books that absolutely changed my life. It was On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. And it was like, for the first time, reading a book that light bulbs went off almost in every sentence. It was filled with new thoughts, new ideas about feminism, about social justice, about, quotes, right and wrong. And it was probably the most important book, I would say, in my entire life, though I've read many since then. And when I went back to school, I was in pre-med and I was doing very well. But at one point, I made a decision. It was not enough for me. Being a psychiatrist, i.e., a therapist, is what my goal was. But I went to literally a substitute teacher who was there for one day only in one of my psych classes. And I told her how frustrated I was because I didn't want to just be focused on the psychology of a person and the physiology. I wanted to study the whole person. I wanted to study anthropology, sociology. I couldn't verbalize it totally, but I just knew I wanted more. Well, this 15-minute conversation changed my life. I never saw her again, but she said, at the University of Chicago, there's this committee, which is not psychology, but it's an interdisciplinary committee that basically focuses on the person as a psychological being living in a physical body, living in a culture and society. And you have to study all parts together and how they all interact. And I said, that's exactly what I want. And so I went there, got interviewed, transferred, and that's where I got my PhD. The other important point, I think it's connected with what you and I have talked about, Alfonso, is that this program did not follow the usual psychology in the sense of at that time, who you were was determined by the time you were 3 years old, etc. The program had the concept of developmental tasks, that at every age, we have different tasks that we have to, in a sense, surmount. The challenges. We have it in our teens, we have it in our 20s, our 30s, and things keep changing as we grow older. And I was blessed with having a teacher, Bernice Newgarden, who taught the courses on aging. And she was adamant that people as they age don't automatically get conservative, that as they age, they become more of who they are. And if they were radical when younger, they become more radical. And if they're conservative, they can become more conservative. And she actually was one of the founders of the field of gerontology. And I attribute much of my thinking to her and her support. And so when I graduated, my goal was to work in community mental health. And for that reason, I took my doctoral exams in Spanish. Usually at the university, it was only in German or French. And I petitioned, said, I'm going to be using Spanish in my work. And for the first time, they agreed and they let me take my exam. Because when I then graduated and moved to New York, I started working in community mental health. And the area that I was working in was at the time considered probably one of the worst slum areas of New York City. And it was the South Bronx. Some people know about it if they ever saw a movie called oh, what was that? I think not Asphalt Jungle. There was another film, um, Fort Apache. That's right, Fort Apache. And that was my area. We worked in a community base. It was a walk-in clinic. People could walk in off the street and come in and be seen and be dealt with. I made home visits, so I got to know not just the neighborhood, but the way people lived. And And quite frankly, that's where I learned therapy was basically the last thing a lot of people needed. What they needed was housing, they needed jobs, they needed a safe environment, etc. And psychotherapy, that was a luxury. And I continued in community mental health for a number of years. Simultaneously, I got thrust into a national leadership position because once I was working in this program, which was interestingly enough, got the Silver Medal Award as the best community mental health program in the country through the American Psychiatric Association. We had a rebellion at Lincoln Hospital, and it was basically the Hispanic and Black staff and a few of us white professionals challenging what was going on. And we ended up having because we were federally funded, we had city investigators, federal investigators coming in because of the gross inequities of the program. And because I was one of the few white professionals supporting it, we got suspended and all were threatened with being fired, etc. And it thrust me into a national position because of this was in the late 60s. This was the time of the Black Panthers. This is the time of the Young Lords who we were working with in our protests. And so I got involved in activist psychology at that time and became a leader and then became a national leader of the organization, which eventually led to my being involved with the American Psychological Association, because by that time, this was now 74, the American Psychiatric Association had already passed their vote that being gay was not a mental illness. And American Psychological, which had no legal bearing as the American Psychiatric did, um, in a sense, had to follow suit. And so I was the first openly gay psychologist to speak to the council about the vote. Um, and the vote was close. There were many psychologists who felt that being gay was a mental illness, but luckily we had enough support from people. So the vote was taken and they agreed with the American Psychiatric Association. And that, in a sense, began my involvement with APA, eventually in helping to form the gay division. And that's a whole other kind of history that I got involved in. But what I think is so important and relevant, I think, to what you want to hear from me is that my experience was not based on theory or based on the books. I was working and being active about my life. And this was reflected in a sense when I was working with the American Psychological Association and we eventually got to study gay and lesbian psychologists. We had staff working with us, and the APA staff said they had never seen any group work together the way we had. And they went into detail about that. And we explained we worked together because this was our life. We were expressing who we were and we related to each other that way, as well as doing, quote, scientific research. And so that, in a sense, went off in one direction. I can
Harold, if
jump
you don't
back.
mind. Oh.
Sure.
No, I was gonna
Yeah.
say, you've done such a really good job, and I thank you so much for this and sharing a little bit of history, not only
Yeah.
about your own experiences, but how you've kind of your introduction into the field, and also your passion for the work that you're doing. For the interest of time, I kind of want to shift gears a little bit because I think it'll be
Sure.
great for our audience to kind of hear a little bit more about your clinical work and your book. Like I'd love for us to, if you will, fast forward to your vision for the work that you're doing with clients and the book that you've written and how it's helped folks. I know we've had the conversation,
Okay.
but yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. I wrote Golden Men. It began basically as a theoretical paper that I published in the mid 90s. Uh, and the paper was a very traditional psychologically written paper, the kind of paper that psychologists write for psychologists. It was not a paper that, was for the general public. But I talked about it in terms of developmental tasks, that we have tasks to deal with. And the whole purpose was about aging, because we're jumping back when AIDS came, and even before AIDS, when it was GRID, I did writing about it and talked about the fact that here is this disease that was about the immune system. And if you wanted to be healthy, you had to take charge of your life and focus on the immune system. And I saw gay men literally choosing to die rather than become older gay men. I had personal conversations, obviously, and many examples. And so my focus was that internalized ageism, internalized gay ageism, was so powerful that here were men choosing to die rather than become middle-aged gay men or old gay men. And so that began my thinking about the gay experience. And eventually, the book Golden Men was about that from two perspectives. One, the perspective that as gay men, we've all come out, and coming out has taught us a lesson. We may think it's a one time experience, but there are skills we've learned in coming out that we can use again as we age. The very same skills we did in coming out can be used entering midlife and can also be used in entering old age. So even though the book is titled Golden Men, the Power of Gay Midlife, it can be used for anyone. And it relates to the people who are watching now who are not gay, because practically every person goes through a process of becoming who they are, whether it be a gay man coming out, a lesbian coming out, a trans person coming out, or a non gay man making a decision that he is a different kind of male. He's not the typical male. Or a woman making a decision she is not going to follow the traditional, so-called traditional path of what it is to be a woman. Every one of us who is making this kind of change goes through a process that is similar to coming out, which is why I can say now that my book can apply to everybody. And one of the things about the book that I was determined to do was to share the knowledge. The book itself is, is divided into a number of parts, but the last part are the exercises, the questions that are asked. And if one looks at it carefully, it's really about 4 years of intensive therapy. There are no answers to the questions, but rather examples of people's lives who've answered those particular questions. And so it's graded so that it's divided into body, mind, and soul. And it's how to take you on the journey. The questions are the questions for you to explore. You come up with the answers. And so what I wanted to do was to write this book that, in a sense, the profession, to share the profession, because all too often therapy is always seen in terms of going to a private office, going into those who can afford to pay or have the insurance. And what I wanted to say is that, look, AA and Al-Anon and all of the various this 12-step programs have proven that people have it within them to move forward. All it takes is for them to have the willingness to explore, to question, and to take responsibility. And so what I based on that knowledge and knowing what I know in terms of therapy, I wanted to give, in a sense, share the knowledge. This book was written so someone outside of the city someone who doesn't have the money or the access to therapy can use the book themselves or gather a bunch of friends or start a group around the book and work with each other. It's sharing the knowledge. And just to say the way I function, when I'm as a therapist working with somebody, and I've had so many times I'll say something and it'll be the response of, oh my God, that's exactly it. Oh, you're so bright, you're so this or you're so that. And I'm saying, look, I say a lot of things and you don't pay attention. It's not relevant. You paid attention to this because it hit something inside of you. You already had the knowledge. So, what you need to learn is how to start accessing that knowledge more.
Harold, you're
And
touching on a.
sometimes, oh,
Sorry, go
what?
ahead. Finish your thought.
No, 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 no. I,
No,
I made the point.
I was gonna say you're touching on a few things that I think are really like pivotal, it feels like. One of the things that I'm thinking about is this idea that, we have it within us, right? We typically have the answers, and we just need the space. And I know you've shared in the past, or at least in conversations you and I have had, like how you've created spaces for historically marginalized communities to have a voice, to have certain conversations, to have the space to not only learn from each other, but elevate and empower each other. And it sounds like that's something that your book is, you're offering this tool for folks to do it all over the country. And what jumped out for me, that's one point. And then what jumped out for me that was pretty significant is you named, for folks who are not in New York City or not, don't have access to therapy, et cetera. It made me think of like how sometimes metropolitan cities can almost be like a bubble, right? And so I think about the clients who are in rural areas who are experiencing like systemic challenges where they just can't like be themselves or can't be openly gay. Even in 2024, this book could be a
Right,
resource for them to at least, learn tools and resources that they can find the strength within or feel empowered enough to be able to navigate the world in a healthy and fulfilling way.
right. Yes, I mean that's the goal, And when the book came out in 2000, I was very specific. I am writing this about white gay men from a white gay man's perspective. I did not want to speak for anybody else. But in the intervening years, I've had so many people, both men, women, gay, non-gay, all white, black, Hispanic, say to me, this applies to me too. And so that's one of the reasons why I decided to republish it and being able to say can be used for everyone. I mean, no book is going to be perfect for every single person. You take what you can from it, but there's a lot everybody can take from it.
Perfect. Um, Harold, if you don't mind, I want to make sure that we talk through because you are speaking to an audience of counselors, counselor educators, counselors in training, supervisors. And I'm wondering if there are any tips you think may be really helpful for folks who are in clinical practice that may be working with this population. What are things we want to be mindful about with this community? Because you're absolutely right, rewind 30, 40 years ago during the AIDS epidemic, there were people who weren't making it past a certain age. And so it feels like to some extent a new phenomenon, right? That we have older or gay elders really that could share
Yeah.
their stories and their experiences because that hasn't really been, we haven't had access to that up until now.
Well, that's one of the dedications in the original book to all of my colleagues, most of whom are dead. I mean, For a lot of people, COVID was the first pandemic. For many of us, it was the second. And I mean, I buried my lover, my two best friends, countless people that I knew. I mean, literally, there was a year in which every day in the New York Times, I read about an obituary of somebody I knew. And so for many of us, it felt like we were in the Warsaw Ghetto during the Second World War, with everything going on normally around the ghetto. But inside, the newspapers weren't talking about it. The president wasn't talking about it. And yet we were dealing with deaths every day. So it had a very different meaning for us then. Um, no, I'd forgotten it. There was a point I wanted to make um, in one your question. Ask me the question again,
Oh,
Alfonso.
sure. I got you. I got you. And so my question was, are there any tips that you have that you
Oh,
can share for counselors who are serving this population or
okay.
supporting this population?
Okay. Okay. When I started in the field, therapists were trained to do diagnoses. And I rebelled against that. And I'm saying that to the people who are watching. Let the diagnosis emerge from getting to know the person. Because I found if I'm constantly trying to do it, make a diagnosis, there's an intellectual process that is kind of framing the interaction. And I found sit back, just listen to who that person is, listen to what they're saying, find out who they are. And if you have a need to come up with a diagnosis, let it emerge from the interaction, not you're imposing it on. Because in my experience, focusing on this, trying to find a diagnosis is always meaning throwing things aside and eliminating to try to narrow down to a diagnosis, as opposed to just sit back and let the person, in a sense, come to you. And then knowing your reaction of how you then can be of help to them.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Do you think there's anything that us as clinicians, counselors need to know about this population, aging or midlife gay men, in clinical practice that we need to be mindful of, pay attention to, focus in on, if at all?
Well, part of the problem is so much now is insurance company based that there are so many forms to fill out that it's a whole system that's being imposed on the therapist that in many ways runs counter to being a good therapist. I'm thinking of something that you and I have talked about. At one point, I was a little concerned because I was seeing so many clients who, quotes, fell in love with me. And yes, it's always been written up that, oh, this is part of the client's pathology and so on, and it's part of therapy to fall in love with the therapist, etc. And when I started realizing how much it was happening, I realized what it was that for at least the men that I was seeing, it was the first time anyone had ever really listened to them, where they could just sit back present who they were with no holds barred, that they could just be themselves. And men, both gay and non-gay, are used to a world that that kind of sharing doesn't take place. It's women are much more akin to that. That's part of the training. It's part of women are to listen to the feelings, etc. You tap most men and you start talking to them about a problem, they'll immediately come up with a solution and the answer. Most people are not telling you that because they want an answer. They're telling you because they're just wanting to share with you what they're feeling, what they're going through.
Yeah. I know
So just
what I'm picking up on what you're sharing is like the importance of creating a safe space for this population just to share what is coming up for them, not necessarily to solve a problem for them, right?
right.
Because to your point, there are a lot of exercises and tools in the book that can like lead them to getting that answer. But to your point, a lot of men, whether gay or straight, really struggle with just having that safety to express what is coming up for them. And it could be because of societal expectations, right? But it also could be like responsibilities of their lifestyle, right? So if it's like a heterosexual man and I need to go to work, I need to do this, I need to do that, I need to provide, or equipment. I'm just looking for ways to survive, and I don't have the capacity to slow down and do that. One of the things that we haven't quite talked about, and I want to open it up for questions, is the ways in which you conceptualize and make sense of like sometimes intersect and marginalized identities, right? As we think about you mentioned your examples from very early on in being arrested, and the people you saw in the space when you were arrested were often folks of color. And so when I think about their racial and ethnic marginalization coupled with their sexual orientation as a marginalized identity, how have you approached the counseling space with them?
I'm sorry, was that a question to me or
A little
to?
bit. Sorry, I talk a lot. I expanded a bit, but I think my question is, with working with clients with intersect and marginalized identities, has there been anything you've done to tailor your approach to working with them or supporting them?
Oof. Well, what came to mind, you know, was one of the groups that I worked with that I actually helped create in New York City in the Department of Mental Health was an LGBT committee for the first time in New York's history. And when we started, we ended up with 3 trans women in the committee. And I was at that time trying to understand and deal with the issue of trans issues. And I realized there were 3 trans women. One was the director of a drug program who had been functioning as a male with his wife, impregnated her, they had a child, then he began the transition to become her. And he or she and her wife and child were still a unit. That was one. The second was the head of the trans group at the community center. She was tall, model, looked like a model, dressed like a model, functioned like a model, and was engaged to a non-gay man. The third was a psychiatrist who was short, kind of a little pudgy, was offensive to everybody. And I said to myself, these are three distinct individuals. They're all trans women, but they are so unalike. And that's when I gave up trying to categorize. And I'm saying that as a reflection of we have this tendency to want to put people into groups, to try to label them. If you want to see the individual, then you have to move back and be frustrated and just be with that individual.
It was great. I felt that, so thank you for that. Um, I want to create some space, and we're doing pretty good on time, y'all. I want to create some space for folks who may have questions. I see there's a question in the chat, and I know Dr. Pamphil also shared that she had a question. So I kind of want to open it up for you, Dr. Pamphil, and then we'll go to Michael. And then so other folks, if you have other
Michael has a
questions,
question. Okay.
if you all have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or we'll have, if we have time, we'll just come off mute.
Thank you for that, Dr. Ferguson. I think, if it's okay, because Michael posed his question here earlier on, Harold, is it okay that I start with Michael's question?
Sure,
Okay,
sure.
good. So one of the things that Michael draws to our attention is that he says, as a gay elder, I am aware that many of my colleagues are going back into the closet in order to live in senior communities. Do you have any recommendations for addressing the issues of oppression and discrimination in elder communities?
I wish I had an easy answer to that. This has been an issue in Sage for a long time, um, about elders who've had to go back into the closet. I frankly have not worked with many elders who are in these communities per se, though I'm at meetings with them at Sage, where so that's been my experience. I cannot say that I know the facility that they live in or met the people there. But what keeps coming out is they have to, in a sense, come out the same way they did when they came out when they were younger. And there are people, it means finding allies. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be gay, but just trying to find allies. Yeah, Michael?
There is some work being done. AARP in 2018 published a book called Disrupting the Status Quo in Senior Living. And they talk about how to change communities so that they are more welcoming. There is a senior community in Portland, Oregon called Rose Villa. And Rose Villa last Friday had the Pride Committee from Portland and Seattle come in and do a workshop with the residents of Rose Villa. And
Uh,
I actually looked at joining, going into that senior community and may at some point, but I went to visit them in June. And when I walked into the community, there were rainbow flags throughout the community. And there were gay and the LGBTQ staff members and residents who were very open and welcoming. So there are some of those communities around. I'm just looking at, I've seen a number of places say that they are LGBTQ friendly, but I ask, what does that mean? And
yeah.
and I say, how many queer folks do you have living here? How many queer folks do you have on staff? And oh, we can't divulge that. Well, why would I want to live in a community where you can't divulge that?
Right.
And so
Michael,
I'm
could you
looking
give me the name of that book? I did not know about it.
at disrupting the status quo in senior living. And
Disrupt.
I don't have the author's name right here.
I also, Michael and Harold, I also dropped the link to the book in the chat. So hopefully everyone can see that. It's on Amazon.
Okay.
Or yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And it doesn't specifically look at queer issues, but it does look at the fact that you're bringing people into communities who have been decision makers in their field all of their lives, and now you treat them as if they are on a cruise. And I've always hated cruises, so 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 I've been a troublemaker. It's like I'm looking at not how do we just help individuals, but how do we help change systems so that the individuals don't have to do all of the work.
Okay. What brings to mind, Michael, is something that I've talked about with Alfonso. 8 years ago, after Ta-Nehisi Coates' book came out, my husband and I made a decision. We wanted to start with the people we knew, our friends. I don't know if Alfonso had said it. My husband is Black. Obviously, I'm white, Jewish. And we wanted to start a discussion about white privilege as well as about racism. And it was 8 years that we met. During COVID, we met actually every month via Zoom. Up to that point, it was in person every 3 months. And one of the things we ended it, everybody acknowledged that no longer would they keep quiet. They now had moved to the place where if anything upset them or they felt they wanted to talk about these issues with anyone in their world, they did. And I think in a way, it reminds me what you're saying, Michael, that it begins with being able to talk to the person next to you.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. One of the things that I say is that my coming out process was challenging enough that I am never going to keep my mouth shut again. And I haven't. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there were two things in the coming out process. There were two moments in my life that were before and after. Years ago, when I was in college, and there was a woman that I was friends with, and I told her I was gay. And she said, "Oh, I already knew that long ago." Well, my internalized homophobia just went rampant. Like, oh, I am so obvious. I'm such a faggot. I'm so this. Also, I mean, I just went through the list. And then I stopped myself and I asked her, I said, how did you know? And she said, because I found myself relaxed with you and not playing games. You treated me like I was another person, and I realized, oh, only a gay man would do that. Well, that totally shifted my thinking about me. And the other moment was when a cousin that I loved dearly, um, I finally came out to her and she said, "Oh, I've known it for years." And then she said something that broke my heart. She said, I was just so hurt you didn't trust me enough to tell me. And that was the moment I made a decision I would never, ever keep it quiet again.
Yeah. I was heterosexually married and met a man when my children were very young. So I left a marriage to be with this man. And my children grew up with an openly gay father because, and the mother of my children is still one of my closest friends. And we still love each other very much in very different ways. But we decided that if we were going to teach our children to be authentic, then we couldn't hide. I could not teach my children to be accepting and not be authentic if I wasn't being real with them.
Right.
And that has been a guiding piece for me in all of the work I've done in social justice and in counseling, is how do I help people maintain their authenticity and to take the risks. And so as I look at training counselors, I keep coming back to that question is, are you being authentic and are you assisting your clients or whatever label you want to put on them uh, to be authentic as well? And how do you teach them to take those risks? And so
Davidson, audio.
yeah, so so um but I guess for me, I just turned 81, and so the next battleground, if you will, is senior communities, and I want to help people be safe in the communities in which they live, and that means working with the communities and not just the individuals.
Well, I think, look, Michael, you've said it. I mean, you want people to be authentic, and you have to be authentic yourself. And I think I think for me, one of the biggest challenges that therapists have of how to be authentic and not be the professional, either psychologist or caregiver or whatever, because it's roles that we play.
Yeah.
And clients pick it up immediately. They immediately know when the person they're talking with is playing a role. They may not be able to verbalize it, but
But they pick up on the dissonance.
huh?
They pick up on the dissonance. The word I'm talking is dissonance, because that's not usually not a loaded word, but they pick up on the dissonance.
Yes.
I just want to jump in really quick. I just want to say I could probably listen to Harold and Michael talk for hours, literally, because I'm grateful for the conversation. I'm loving the conversation, and I really appreciate your question, Michael, because you kind of took us somewhere that I didn't even know we needed to go, but I'm very grateful that we went. And that said, I also recognize we have a few minutes left, so I may have to cut us a little short.
Okay.
And this is just a testament that we probably need to continue this conversation with maybe a part two. So let's see what we can work out for maybe another round or coming back in the spring semester.
Absolutely.
But before you all leave, I want to make sure that for those of you who are looking to obtain CEUs, Dr. Pamfield put the link in the chat a few minutes ago. So all you would have to do is go in, complete the survey, and someone would reach out with your CEU information in the coming days, maybe even a week or two, giving us some time to like regroup and get ourselves together. But before everyone logs off, I just want to express my sincerest gratitude and appreciation for you all spending your Friday with us, or a little piece of your Friday with us. It's just been really good to kind of hear Harold share not only his professional experiences, but also a little bit about his personal experience. And every time I talk with Harold, I learn something new about not only his lived experience, but his passion for the work. So thank you all so much. And as you all know, if this is your first time, CSJ is always doing webinars and events virtually. So be on the lookout for upcoming events, right? I know as the research team, we have a few things planned for the rest of the academic year. So maybe something in December, and then we have a few things in the spring. So please, please keep your ear to the ground, because we love to be in community. We love to engage, and we love to share our knowledge and resources with you all. So thank you all for coming out, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. All right, y'all. Be well. It's November.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At any time, Afonso.
Oh yeah, I'll be calling. I will be
Okay.
calling. So no,
Good.
this has been really, really good. I feel really full from the experience, and my hope is that other people feel really full and taken care of from the experience. Bye, Dr. Vasquez. Thank you so much for joining.
Okay.
All right. All right, Harold, let me stop recording. I probably should have did that earlier. 1 second. There we go.